it in 2001, maybe
right.
2002, something like that. It may be back out of print, but there's enough copies out there that you can get one.
You know, Jonathan, just a word I want to acknowledge Richard Buck. That book, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, is so profound. It's all over the world, and it applies to kids and to adults, and it is so empowering. It was one of the big inspirations of my life. So I think it's very fortuitous and synchronistic that he was involved in remote viewing, which is really extraordinary. You were talking about Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann and the work at SRI.
Right. So, you know, the program went on for a long time, for years. I got involved in it in 1983 because they had started to develop this controlled remote viewing process, which I'd mentioned earlier. They started developing that in the very early 80s, under contract, really, to the Army Intelligence and Security Command.
What does the Army Intelligence and Security Command do? Can you just give the listener a context?
It's kind of the one-stop shop for intelligence in the Army. Every Army relatively large Army unit, combat unit, has an intelligence staff officer and staff team, and those guys help the commander. But the Army itself has a much larger intelligence responsibility, and so a large major command, we're talking thousands of people, was created, let's say in the mid-'70s, called the Army Intelligence and Security Command, to bring together all of the functions of intelligence that the Army is supposed to do. And the intelligence training is part of it, because they have to train all these folks around in all the combat units, and plus the people who participate in the joint kind of intelligence collection organizations like Defense Intelligence Agency and National Security Agency. So it both trains and uses Army intelligence personnel.
How is it different than the CIA? Just for the listener.
Well, there's several different ways. First of all, the CIA is a strictly civilian organization directly under the president. And they collect strategic, they collect diplomatic, they collect sociological, they collect all of these broader categories of information and intelligence that's important for our senior decision makers to make the right choices. Hopefully they do. Sometimes they don't. INSCOM and Army intelligence, it has a more specific mission of collecting intelligence that is militarily relevant.
Got it. Okay.
To support the warfighter and that sort of thing. Now, of course, they get up to higher levels. They do collect some diplomatic and such if it pertains to military type things, right? So, anyway, so that's the overall function of INSCOM, and of course, it became the home to remote viewing, but that happened a little bit later. Anyway, the program at SRI proceeded along, and they had a number of different sponsors. The CIA bailed out in 1975. For a lot of different reasons, partly because they were actually under scrutiny by Congress because of a bunch of things they shouldn't have ought to done, and they did. And so the CIA was in trouble, and the current director said, well, let's get rid of anything that is controversial or dangerous or illegal. And, of course, remote viewing fit in the controversial part, so they just kind of abandoned the program. Air Force picked it up for a little while, and then ultimately Army became a sponsor. And finally, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the military's answer to the CIA.
Do you accept the information that other countries' intelligence agencies were at work on something similar to remote viewing prior to the U.S. getting into it?
We know the Soviets were, and some of the Eastern Bloc countries were part of the effort.
Interesting.
But whether anybody else was or not, I think the evidence is pretty slim. Now, later on, I think that some of the Western countries, perhaps China, sort of said, hey, this looks interesting, let's see if we can do anything. But I don't think any of their efforts measured up size or success to ours or the Soviets. The Soviets was huge. They were spending hundreds of millions of dollars in this realm and associated realms, which makes it kind of silly when people complain about the American program. They say, well, gee, the U.S. spent $20 million on this psychic stuff. How silly is that? That's $20 million over 23 years. It's less than $1 million a year. I mean, that isn't even above the noise level in the national budget, not even in the defense budget. The Soviets are spending hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's it's an interesting comparison of scale there to see.
It's even thought in some circles, Paul, that the Soviets have extremely advanced scientific information and studies about the area of frequency, electromagnetics, in health and in other areas.
They obviously were focusing on that area. How good their research was is open to debate.
Okay.
As we've noticed a number of times during the Cold War, we thought the Soviets were far more advanced than it turned out they really were in many fields. There were a number of gaps. One of them was the missile gap, where we thought the Soviets had us outclassed. We found out later, actually, that they didn't. But we started really going crazy because we didn't want to be vulnerable to them, and so we really outbuilt them. We ended up with far superior technology and weapons than the Soviets did, and it was almost an accident. It was a misperception that it happened that way.
Is that something that was verified through remote viewing?
Oh, no, that's stuff that we've been able to learn from conventional intelligence.
Got it.
Remote viewing is more of a surgical tool. It probably isn't going to answer that broad of a question.
Got it.
But we did do stuff against Soviet missile developments, for example, and so probably remote viewing contributed to some of that.
What did you do at the Monroe Institute? And could you explain what the Monroe Institute influence was in your training and thinking and what they were doing with frequencies and left and right hemispheres and this thing called Hemisync?
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting and of course very involved topic on its own. But sort of the short version, the Monroe Institute was founded by a guy named Robert Monroe, who's famous in out-of-body circles because he wrote the book Journeys Out of the Body. The whole idea of out-of-body experience, that term actually was coined to describe what was happening with Bob Monroe. And it was coined by a famous parapsychologist, psychologist, Charles Tart. Tart was actually working with Monroe trying to figure out what the heck was going on with him. So Monroe had these experiences, and he thought, well, gee, how can we get other people to have those kind of experiences too? Because there are people who want them, but I don't know how to tell them how to do it. I can tell them, but I can't get them to. And he was actually kind of a pioneer in commercial radio. So he thought, oh, I'm a sound engineer. Maybe there's something we can do with sound. And so he developed this technology that involved the frequency following response of the brain. Basically, what you do is you play one tone, a sound tone in one ear, and you play another tone in the other ear that's just slightly out of phase. It's just a slightly different note than the one that's going in the ear. And you've probably heard where two tones come together, but they're not quite in sync, and you get this wavering sound. Woo, 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 kind of like that. Well, whatever. Anyway, the interesting thing is if you play that through the ears, of course, the ear converts the sound to an electrical signal. And so you have two slightly out of phase electrical signals, one coming from each ear, and they meet in the middle in the brain, and it creates a third frequency. That's that woo, woo, woo sound. And by varying the tone, you can make that a faster or a slower frequency. And Bob discovered that if you did this right, you could get both hemispheres synchronized on that frequency.
And what would the benefit of that be?
Well, they're still finding that out. One of the benefits seems to be that it enhances the learning experience. Another one is that you can kind of impose moods or states of consciousness. You can help induce a certain state of consciousness in a person. And so Bob was, of course, trying to find the right brain state that would allow people to go out of body.
By the way, what you said before that is absolutely fascinating about being able to induce mood states via frequency. I'm sure that has a substantive focus in somewhere on the earth in terms of how far that can be expanded, both positive probably and negatively as well.
There are some psychologists that are actually working with this. So it came to be called Hemisync for hemispheric synchronization. So Hemisync, some psychologists working with this, trying to see how it applies in a classroom learning environment or how it might work in therapy with patients, things like that. And there have been some interesting results. I haven't really followed it closely, so I can't really tell you much about that. But But I know there's research ongoing. There have been some